So this one's for anyone who has ever made themselves smaller in the name of being chosen, being loved, or being seen as enough. So I'm going to share with you how I broke the cycle of shrinking for partners who just couldn't meet my needs. And even more excitingly, how I called in the relationship of my fucking dreams. How over time I became so fixated on being chosen and desired by men that all of my behaviors and things that I would do and say were geared towards the ultimate goal of being chosen and desired by them. And it was like this realization of like, okay, I've started to break the cycle, but I'm still engaging in behaviors that are not aligned with the relationship that I'm trying to call in. All right, my little wild ones, welcome back. This is Too Much, Not Enough, the podcast where we stop shrinking, start trusting, and reclaim every part of ourselves. The good, the shiny, the meh, the messy, and most importantly, the things we think are ugly. I'm Hannah, your host, and today's episode is just you and me, cutie. So snuggle up, maybe go for a walk, a run, clean the house, whatever your little heart desires, because we're going to have a little chat. One of the reasons that I started this podcast is because once I dropped the sort of curated, perfect version of my life that I was presenting out to the people around me, to the world, and became more open about the challenging, painful, messy, what I thought were, you know, really shameful parts of my life and the things that I was going through, I started seeing this pattern in the people around me, more specifically, the women around me. The more I shared, the more they shared with me. And I realized we were all sort of having these similar experiences. They were all sort of overlapping. They might have been in different arenas, different kind of subjects, but they were sort of overlapping. And I started thinking, how silly. We're all carrying so much and kind of trying to stuff these things away in dark corners so no one can see who we really truly are because we somewhere along the way picked up the story that that was undesirable and we might get rejected because of them. And we're stuck in these cycles of like shame and suffering, and we're just human beings experiencing being human. And the more we talk about it, the more clear that becomes. And we can actually break these patterns and cycles. I've learned first by acknowledging that they are not as horrific as we think they are, and then by sharing them because we realize that other people are going through the same thing. And most importantly, I realized that the things that I was most afraid of were the key to the freedom and joy that I was so desperately seeking. So today, I want to talk about a cycle that it took me so very long to break, decades, in fact. But fuck, am I so glad that I finally stepped off the hamster wheel of this specific cycle. So this one's for anyone who has ever made themselves smaller in the name of being chosen, being loved, or being seen as enough. Because is that ever a massive human experience? I'm going to share with you how I broke the cycle of shrinking for partners who just couldn't meet my needs. And even more excitingly, how I called in the relationship of my fucking dreams. Like literally the shit that I fantasized about as a little girl, as a teenager, as a young adult, thinking maybe this actually doesn't exist, but how amazing would it be if it does? And I am here to tell you, it does. And while I'm going to be talking today about my romantic relationships specifically, this can apply to love in all forms. It can be, how we stop shrinking for family, for friends, and call in that like big, intimate love, platonic, romantic, that I think at a base level, every human being truly desires. Before I dive in, I do want to clarify one thing. While I am attracted to both men and women, all of my romantic history, my long term relationships have been with men. So I'm going to be speaking almost exclusively about men today. But this topic, what I talk about, is not exclusive to men. We as human all have behaviors that can be hurtful, that can cause others pain. And so as I'm talking, I just ask that you keep that in mind. This is not a men hating episode. I love men. I have many beautiful men in my life. It just simply is the facts of the experience. So, this cycle that I am talking about is how over time I became so fixated on being chosen and desired by men that I absolutely sort of shrank in their presence, that all of my behaviors and things that I would do and say were geared towards the ultimate goal of being chosen and desired by them. And I can sort of trace this back to elementary school, to when I was a little girl. I was not particularly popular in elementary school. Can't imagine why, because I was one fucking cool kid. But kids can be mean, and that is just a fact. And I was bullied a lot by both boys and girls. But I was not popular with boys. I was teased a lot by them and often rejected by them. I was not one of the girls that the boys had a crush on. I was not one of the girls that the boys would all talk about, at least not to my knowledge. And I was very aware of this at the time, obviously, but also, afterwards. And I think maybe part of that is because I've always loved boys. I've always been interested in boys from a very young age. I remember back when we were living in England, like I was probably around 5 or 6 years old. And I remember having a boy over who I had a crush on. I lived in a very small town, went to a very small school. And I remember taking him into this closet and being like, we should kiss. And like, just essentially being kind of the leader of that kind of stuff, of wanting to like talk to boys and kiss boys and things like that. It was something that I was interested in from a very young age. My boy craziness started early. And so I was very aware in elementary school that the boys weren't interested in me. I wanted them to be interested in me. And then came high school. I went to a high school sort of outside of my district without, I didn't go with any of the kind of kids that I went to elementary school with. Essentially, it was like a fresh start, very exciting for me. And that was partly because I had not had a great elementary school experience and I had been quite bullied. And, I think my parents thought it would be good for me to have just a fresh start with new kids. And it was. I loved my high school experience. And I started getting a lot more male attention, essentially. And it felt really good. Like I had a lot of guy friends, and, there was a lot of instances where I was dating boys. I use the word dating loosely. It was like high school dating where you like talked on the phone a bunch, but like probably didn't talk in person, ignored each other's in the halls. And then it lasted 2 weeks. And then your heart was broken and you were listening to Shania Twain's Whose Bed Have Your Boots Been Under on repeat all weekend. Just me? No? Okay. I had lots of crushes, had lots of little flings with boys, dating scenarios, and I really liked it. I loved it. I loved the attention. I loved having friendships with guys and I loved having relationships with guys. I also got a lot of attention from the older boys. I remember in grade 9 dating a guy in grade 12. It very much flipped for me. I went from not popular, teased, not on boys' radars to very much being on boys' radars. And I loved it. And then somewhere along the way from that sort of progression, I realized I was contorting myself to fit what I thought men wanted. So consistently, essentially burying my own wants and needs beneath theirs and getting sort of smaller in service of them. And even more so, really, in service of being chosen and desired by them. I would just the first thing when I met a new boy, started talking to a new boy, the first thing I would be thinking about was if they liked me, not how I felt about them or if I was getting any of my needs fulfilled, but did they like me? And if not, what could I do to change that? And that really created this pattern where all of my, thoughts and energy were overwhelmingly directed at getting male attention. And I think this is not an exclusive thing for me, but tracing it back, I spent a lot of time and energy getting male attention, and not just from the perspective of like what I wore and makeup, but like kind of all facets of my personality and, how I showed up in situations and what a night out was focused on, which was meeting boys, getting boys' numbers, or making out with a boy. And that kind of got to a point where I would be shattered, quite significantly upset if I had gone out or gone on a weekend away and I didn't get enough attention from men. Every time I walked into a restaurant or a bar, what men were looking at me, like who was interested in me, kind of thing, which oftentimes led to, especially for anyone who knows what living in Toronto is like, men are not very forward in this city. So I was often super disappointed because I wasn't getting hit on and I wasn't getting a ton of male attention, especially as I got like later into my 20s. And I would immediately make me the problem. How I dressed, how I looked, very much how I looked. My personality, I wasn't flirty enough. I wasn't whatever it was. I was always looking at my girlfriends that were in my group and thinking, well, they're so much more beautiful than me. Obviously, the men are going to want to go to them first, and I'm kind of sloppy seconds. And so this just really became ingrained in my like overall thinking about how I related to men and what I represented to men. And this led to me putting myself in a number of quite dangerous and risky situations when I look back on it because of this like desperate desire to be wanted and needed. And when you mix in alcohol and emotions, I would do things that maybe felt like I wanted in the moment, but when I look back, I didn't really. Uh, yeah, I put myself in pretty dangerous situations to meet this need of wanting to be chosen. And now I realize that that was like a pretty desperate cry for acceptance and intimacy, but it ended up leading to a lot of unsatisfying, drunk, and unprotected sex that prioritized men's pleasure every single time over mine. And that's not to say that I didn't get pleasure and enjoyment from it, but that first and foremost, it was about them and what they were experiencing. And then as a byproduct of the act, I got to experience some pleasure, which meant that sex became very much about performing first and pleasure second for me. And that's something that I am still working to unravel today. And maybe we'll do a future episode about that. But it turns out that I had this deeply ingrained belief that I was not lovable or desirable. And this is something that goes back a long time and just sort of seeped into all my relationships with men. It was really rather about what I could offer. So essentially, something that became very clear to me after I ended my last long-term relationship was that I had gone into every relationship I'd ever been in, whether it was serious or not, thinking what I offered to the relationship rather than who I was as a person. And that's kind of a wild thing to realize in your 30s that, like, I don't think I've ever been fully myself in any relationship I've ever been in because I have always been fixated on what can I do for this person rather than how can I be around this person. And this quickly evolved into not only me focusing on how I could be of service to my partner, I guess, and what I could do for them in order to keep them interested, but then me very quickly self-abandoning any of my needs because each time I stated what I needed and it wasn't met, I would reinforce this belief that I didn't deserve those things, that I wasn't like a whole human in this relationship, and that I was, in fact, there to provide what my partner needed, and then essentially got stuck in this loop of self abandoning my needs. I would state what I wanted. I would say, I want more of this or I need more of that. But when my partner showed that they did not have any desire to make an effort to meet those requests, I would pretend like they weren't that big of a deal. Again, therefore reinforcing that I was there to be of service and not there to be my whole self. And as this kept happening, I then started subconsciously believing this story that I was too demanding, I was asking too much, I was unworthy of the things that I wanted. So I kept attracting and building my life around men who were not emotionally available, who were not in a place where they could meet my needs. And then, therefore, it kept reinforcing this belief that my needs weren't worthy of being met and that I was just there to perform a service for my partner and not to be in reciprocal relationship with them. And then it turned into it feeling safer for me to sit in resentment of my needs not being met than to do something about repeatedly being shown that I was not a priority. And so I kept attracting these men who needed therapists and then became the therapist slash mother figure in some weird fucked up way, trying to fix whatever it was that they needed help with or support with or fixing, in hopes that eventually that would mean that they would start meeting my needs, but instead continuing to keep the pattern alive with my own actions. And I basically took on this identity of the therapist, the emotional support, the cool, chill girl who was happy to kind of morph into my partner's life and what they wanted, because it was easier to do that than to walk away and be alone, which at the time absolutely terrified me. Because again, I had this belief, this story that I was not desirable for men, so I should take what I can get. And this pattern, this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of attracting men who needed a fixer rather than a girlfriend, a partner, an equal, led me into my last long-term relationship, which ended up pushing me to my absolute breaking point, which I talk about on the first episode. So I burned my life down at 33. So I won't go over the details here, but if you would like to, you can go back and listen to that. But what I will say is that I knew very early on in that relationship that it was not right for me, but I was being heavily pursued by someone and I liked that attention. And I also liked that he needed help and that I could fulfill the role that I knew how to play ever so well of being his savior, his safe place. And as the relationship went on, I kept being met with not only the reinforcement that I was not worthy of my needs, being recognized in the relationship, but in fact that any time I showed any sort of emotion, that got shut down because I didn't know what it was like to truly struggle or to truly feel what real humiliation felt like. So I just kept making myself smaller and smaller and shrinking to keep the peace. And I knew in the moments when I was asking for what I wanted and constantly being maybe told, yeah, I hear you, I understand, but then no follow up, no action, the same behaviors just happening again and again. I knew it wasn't right. And I think this is the thing. We don't get into these relationships where we shrink and make ourselves small to continue to be loved. we don't get into them and are completely unaware that bad behaviors are happening or that things aren't right. We're aware. It's just that we have this story that we're asking for too much, or we're too demanding, or what we want doesn't actually exist. And it's so funny when I was in that relationship, because I was in it for 7 years before we broke up, every like article that came up that was like 7 signs you're with your, lifetime partner, or 4 reasons you should break up, or take this quiz to see if like you're in a healthy relationship. I would click on every single one of those articles to, I guess, get some validation maybe of what I was feeling. So it wasn't that I didn't know that things weren't right. It was that I didn't have the belief that my needs were worthy of being met and prioritized. And so I just kept shoving them down in a corner and pretending like they weren't that big of a deal. And that led to my body absolutely pushing back at some point because it was fucking sick of me pretending that I didn't matter and what I wanted didn't. And after a lot of self-reflection, I have realized that as a neurodivergent who deals with a lot of sensory issues, I grew up in a world that taught me to hide myself in order to be accepted, and that my wants and needs were too much, simply by the fact that everywhere I went, I was bombarded and overloaded by sensory input, but that everyone around me seemed to be okay with this. So I must be the problem, that I can't handle these things. And so I think that's where this story really came from, that my needs were somehow wrong and there because everyone else around me seemed to be fine. And then that seeped into my relationships because my partners kept telling me that I was too emotional or too demanding, or they kept showing me through their actions that what I wanted was not realistic. And so it all kind of cemented in me that like what I wanted was not realistic. And really what it boils down to at the end, because I'm not going to take all the blame off the men that I was in relationships with who refused to do the work to meet me where I needed to be met. But it always takes 2 people in a relationship. And I think I used a lot of these relationships with men to distract myself from being real and vulnerable with my needs because it felt safer to reinforce a story than to admit that I had been self-abandoning to avoid the pain of consistently, since I was a child, not having my needs met. And so all of that is sort of my self-reflective understanding of how I got into this cycle of consistently shrinking for men and being in relationships with men who were not the right match for me at all, but like seemingly continuing to attract them. And this became very clear after I ended my long-term relationship. The years that followed that breakup in 2021 were spent doing a lot of hard work and untangling myself from these stories that I had created that had been built up in my mind over time. And the cycle didn't just like break once and for all when I broke up with my last partner. That breakup was a huge part of breaking the cycle, but then it took time to really understand A, like what had been happening, and B, to stop repeating the behaviors that had gotten me into these relationships with these men and had been, attracting these men. And it took a few goes around to each time make a new choice that was better for me. Like each time I learned something new, each time I went on a date or, was chatting to a guy or started seeing a guy, I'd be able to make a different decision each time. And this was the huge part of breaking the cycle. Because that's the thing. You don't just like realize something is not good for you and then immediately stop doing it. Often it's like this spiral and it keeps coming back around, and you're maybe faced with the same decisions, the same unavailable men keep being presented to you, maybe in slightly new, shinier packaging. And, it's almost like this kind of test of like, is what you're saying you want what you really want? If so, here you go. Are you going to make the same decision or are you going to make a different one? And in this case, I desperately needed to start making a different decision. First and foremost, around will give you a lot when I am in relationship with you, whether that is romantic, platonic, any types of relationships in my life. I'm going to pour so much into you, and I am going to see your value and your worth, and I'm going to draw it out of you. So I commit, I give a lot to those I love. And so the biggest thing that I needed to learn was to recognize when someone was not going to place that same effort in me and walk away, which I hadn't been very good at doing up until that point. So this brings me to re-entering the world of dating at 33 years old, living at my parents' house. I took some time, obviously, after the breakup to sort of reset and recalibrate. And I think for me, it was like, so we broke up in the December and I went on my first date in August. Now, listen, there is no correct timeline to wait after you break up with someone. For me, that was just simply sort of what made sense at the time. Getting back into dating involved going on dating apps, which I had not been on ever, because when I was single in my early 20s, they were newer and not like as used as they are now. But essentially, I started going on dating apps, which was this whole fucking new world for me, and, started going on dates. And I will say the very first date I went on was was perfect. He was so handsome and so sweet. He was quite a bit younger than me by like 6 or 7 years, I think, at the time. At that time, I was very interested in casual, and to me, going much younger felt super casual. It was a perfect first date. I was so freaking nervous. And it was just like easy conversation, such a gentleman. But looking back on it, like quite just like plain, not a lot of excitement there. We ended up seeing each other a few times and, nothing really came of it. And I kept chatting to different guys and obviously went through the whole typical thing of like being ghosted on the app and then going on a date and then being ghosted right after the date, even though the person on the date is like, I really enjoyed this. We should do it again sometime. And then just doesn't answer your messages or unmatches, which I've never understood. I don't think you have to go in a whole thing. Like, my rule is if you've gone on a date and neither person reaches out after, it's cool. It's a wash. Don't worry about it. But if you've gone on a date that has gone well, that nothing like terrible happened, if one person reaches out, then I think it is appropriate that the other person just simply say, like, you know what? Thank you so much. It was lovely. You are lovely. Not the right match for me. Yes, it feels difficult to do that because you're like rejecting someone and that doesn't feel good. But of all the people I've talked to, they would much rather know, okay, they're not interested, than sit there and wonder and go into a spiral in their head. It's easier to just be like, nope, he's not it or she's not it. And then I got to move on. I truly cannot understand this whole ghosting thing at all. But anyways, I went through all of that stuff. And this other guy kind of came in. We'll call him Mr. Gray, or at least that's what me and my friends called him. He introduced me to the fact that when I was single in my 20s, guys would send dick pics a lot of time. They were photographs, stills. And Mr. Gray introduced me to the concept of dick videos, which is, I guess, the modern version of a dick pic, where you receive a video of the man's penis. And he was lovely, very fun, very exciting, very like spicy kind of in the bedroom, and really like reawakened a lot of that for me because a lot of that had kind of gone dormant in my previous relationship. And so he was absolutely like the right match from that perspective of like sparking that inner fire, and like sensuality and, reconnecting to that part of me. But it became very obvious that he was struggling with a lot of stuff and he was fairly open about it. And it came to a point where we were like going back and forth trying to get together, and then he'd kind of flake and it was a little bit weird, but I liked him and we'd had some really amazing like long phone conversations, and I was like, there's something here I want to pursue. But I think the very first moment I realized, oh, I am starting to break this cycle for good, was when he had reached out to me for something. He was having a tough weekend. He was struggling, with some big emotions and feelings. And he reached out to me to talk about it after he had blown me off. And so I was feeling a little bit like, sorry, you just blew me off and now you need me to support you through something. And listen, any human being who is struggling, I don't want them to feel alone. I want them to feel supported. And so I did. But I, at the same time, was like, listen, I have been in this habit of being a therapist for the men I am in relationships with, and it is just something I cannot continue doing. It ended very badly for me last time, and it's not something I'm willing to take into future relationships. So I just don't think that this is going to work. And you know what? He was very like a decent amount of awareness, and he said, I respect that. You're right. I think I am kind of relying on you for that kind of role, and I appreciate that that's not something that you want to do. And so that was sort of that first moment of being like, whoa, okay, I've recognized the pattern. And while I'm not completely out of the woods, I am starting to break the pattern, and it felt really freaking good. And then the next sort of clear moment for me, where it wasn't so much that I was successfully breaking the pattern, but that I did not want to continue down the road I was going on. As I mentioned previously, got into a lot of, kind of risky behavior, especially combining drinking, with one night stands. And I was traveling for work. I was working on an event where I was on location for a few weeks. And one of the crew guys, I thought he was super cute. I was texting with him about some stuff we needed to sort of coordinate. And he was like lived locally. And I was once again in this kind of fixated mindset that I, was single and I was away and I needed to have some sort of holiday romance in order to, like, again, I guess, feed into this story that I was hot and would be chosen by another man. So I kind of like forced this conversation into like a more flirty territory, and let him know that I was interested. And so it was the wrap party of the event, and he came. And it's like I completely abandoned anything else that I might have wanted to do that night to focus on being with him, hooking up with him. And so we did. We, went back to the hotel, we hooked up. We like went to a different hotel to hook up because the hotel that I was staying at, like a bunch of people who he worked with were there. And it was like he didn't feel comfortable. He felt it would be unprofessional to be seen like coming back to my room late at night. So we went to this like different hotel that was like not great. Also, probably part of not feeling very good because it felt quite cheap and like rent by the hour situation. Anyways, he drops me back off at my hotel in the morning and asks me for money. And my heart just like was in my throat. And I was like, what the fuck have you done, Hannah? Like, you have put yourself in this situation with this man. And it was all these emotions at once. It was like, I felt shame. I felt stupid because I thought he actually liked me and he actually just wanted to hang out with me, and he didn't. He saw me as a bit of a meal ticket and, asked me for money. It was a little bit like, okay, this is a spoiler alert. So anyone who hasn't watched season 3 of White Lotus, you might want to skip ahead a little bit. But in one of the episodes where, oh my gosh, I forget her name, but one of the 3 girlfriends, she goes out to that fight night and then goes home with one of the Russian guys, I believe. And then he is talking about how his mother is sick and kind of like essentially conning her for money. And she's just like, what is happening? Like, they've just had sex. She's just like, had this wild night, kind of abandoned the regular way she acts and went a little crazy and went home with this guy and had sex with this guy. And then she's lying in bed with him and he's like, kind of hitting her up for money. And she's like, oh God. And the realization that washes over her in that moment, I just like went right back to that feeling of the realization washing over me that like, I had been so single-minded about wanting to like have a holiday romance and feel wanted and desired and picked by this guy. And then all at once it kind of came crashing down with this realization that he just saw me as a way to get money because where he lived and where I'm from, and so much shame came up. And it was really one of those pivotal moments for me that was like, wow, I fully put myself in this situation, but I didn't want the situation. I didn't want this. I was doing it to prove to myself that I was desirable, that I was worthy, and was left feeling the exact opposite of that, that I was just totally being used. And it was like this realization of like, okay, I've started to break the cycle, but I'm still engaging in behaviors that are not aligned with the relationship that I'm trying to call in, that are not aligned with the intimacy that I want to build with someone. And so, if I really want this beautiful relationship that I have always dreamed and believed was possible, that I broke off my long-term relationship in order to go out and find what was more aligned for me, then I needed to start behaving in alignment with that. I needed to start showing up as my full, messy self and realize that if that was too much or not enough for some guy, then that was not my guy. And that at the end of the day, I would rather be single and happy in who I am than get back into another relationship where I shrink or focus on things that meet this fear rather than this like expansive, joyful version of myself. And so I started approaching dating with that in mind. And I will say at the same time as I've been sort of like, diving back into the dating pool, I moved out and lived on my own. And I learned what it was like to truly enjoy my own company, to truly create a life that was solely based on my wants and needs because I was single, I was living alone. And I didn't have to answer to anyone. I didn't have to compromise with anyone, which is, part of a relationship. There is compromise. Sometimes too much compromise can mean one person is not being seen or prioritized, but compromise is necessary. And I was in this situation where I was like building this life I fucking loved. And I was learning how to enjoy my own company and my own peace for the very first time, really, in my life. And I was like, whoa. And it really connects to this saying that I see a lot on socials. Men think that they're competing with other men when it comes to women, but actually, what they're competing with is the woman's sense of peace. Like, are they worth taking away from a single woman's sense of peace? And honestly, that was such a vital part of me figuring out how to show up bigger in a relationship, how to bring my whole self to a relationship. Because by being single, and like, yes, I was dating, but by generally being single, I was learning how much I actually did really like myself when I was able to see myself not in the reflection of someone else and not, as a reaction to someone else, but just as me. And I really fucking liked that girl. I really liked her. And I was like, oh no, I would rather spend the rest of my life just me and her than shut her down to be in relationship with someone else. I mean, the ideal scenario would to be with someone else who would draw this version of myself out of me that I really loved more and more and more. But if that's not possible, then I'm just going to be single. And so I started approaching dating like that. And that, I believe, amongst, all the other work I had done, is the reason I called in Lee, my now partner, who I am fucking obsessed with. And so I'm going to tell you all about how Lee and I met and the things that I did that allowed me to show up from day one as myself in the relationship, and how I have been more myself with him than in any other relationship, romantic or not, in my entire life, and how that has had massive ripple effects into the rest of my world. So, on that note, come back next week for part 2. And before you go, if I can ask a little favor, if you can follow, rate, review on whatever platform you're listening on, it makes such a huge difference to be able to continue bringing these conversations to you. And maybe if this resonated with you or would maybe resonate with a friend, you could share it with them. It's free to do so, and it takes like 2 seconds, and I would really, really, really appreciate it.